Hey, so I also wanted to do a quick, brief discussion of the stories that you read last week. There was a little bit of misconception about the Secret Life of Walter Mitty, so I wanted to clear that up. So a bunch of you in your papers, your response papers, chose to write about that story, and you refer to his flashbacks to the war. We don't know that Thurber's character actually fought in any war. Those are his imaginings. So I just wanted to be clear about that. This is not a story of him having PTSD or intrusive thoughts from warfare. It's really a story about a man who likes to imagine a different life than he has. Maybe it's a story about marital discontent. Maybe it's a story about the kind of dreamy, sort of ineffective person. A lot of Thurber's male characters ended up being this way, kind of like small men who didn't get things done. I don't know why. I don't know why he chose to write about that. But that's the kind of character that Walter Mitty is. Walter Mitty is not, he's not a bad character. I mean, he's not a bad man. He's lovely. Just kind of like a daydreamer and like not necessarily steady or firm. And we see his character and personality contrasted to his wife's personality and character, and she's like this, like checklists and stuff. So yeah, James Thurber's character Walter Mitty may have fought in the war, but we don't know that about him, and that's not really what's happening. What's happening is he's making up a version of reality that he would prefer to live in, maybe that he would prefer to live in his head, from things that happen around him. So now that we've talked about plot structure, or we will a couple of videos below, well, here's a preview if you're watching this video first. It's interesting to think about now that we've talked about setting, which we will below, it's interesting to think about what the setting is of a story like The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Because, like, the setting is Waterbury, Connecticut, right? That's the city they've gone to. But it's also not Waterbury, Connecticut, because it's literally inside of Walter Mitty's imaginative brain, right? Same with The Harvest. I don't know that she gives us a setting. Does she? I know, I mean, Amy Hempel writes mostly about California. So I think that's where I always picture it, right? So, like, obviously the character's in a place, right? But she's also she's moving throughout time back to the past, having these flashbacks. She's also living in this altered reality, like Walter Mitty, where she's telling us certain things happen and then telling us they didn't, saying she's exaggerating things. Both stories, well, The Harvest is certainly a story about trauma and what it does to the brain. Walter Mitty may be a bit more about what boredom does to the brain. I don't know. Anyway, so those were notes on that. As far as the lesson is fascinating when it comes to both setting and plot structure, really, because it's told from one girl's perspective, right? So the main character, her voice is really distinct. We get her personality, we get how she's kind of fresh but like super smart. We get her judgments. We see everything through her eyes, but there is a setting, right? And the setting ends up partially being a toy store. And the plot ends up being a discussion about money. And the conflict is there's multiple conflicts. You think the antagonist, right, is going to be Miss Moore, but it really ends up being the discriminating aspect of wealth that divides the society of America and how race enters into that, right? So we think the antagonist to the protagonist of the children, especially our main girl, whose name escapes me. I should have reviewed that. I'm sorry. We think it's going to be Miss Moore because that's kind of how it's set up in the exposition of the story. But it's not. It's something bigger. It's something that isn't even human, but is perpetuated by humans. So that story is really, it's interesting to think about what the lesson is or what the many different lessons are in that story. And it's interesting to think about the arc of that story, the plot arc of that story, and how it works and how it fits into our lives as readers. Sonny's Blues, probably the longest thing you've read so far. Really beautifully written. James Baldwin is just a haunting writer. He's incredible. that's interesting with regard to plot too, because we're moving throughout time. So we're going back and forth to a past, to a present, and our speaker is also concerned about the future. But it's interesting. One question I always ask about Sonny's Blues to myself and to students is like, who is the story really about? Like, who learns the lesson, right? Like, we're conditioned to think by the main character and his voice that Sonny is the problem, right? His brother is the problem. But is that true? His brother seems to ultimately, at the end of things, at the end of the story, have things together and know what he wants and knows what he believes in, and the speaker is the person learning to respect that. And so both of those stories together, I think, are interesting to think about. Who's teaching, who's learning, who's the antagonist, who's the protagonist, where is the conflict when it comes to things like plot structure. Even more interesting when next week when we start talking about point of view and character, there'll be other stories that go with that element. But it's interesting to think and apply all of the things we're learning to all of the stories we read. What's your third story? Oh, Boys and Girls. Yeah, Boys and Girls, probably the more traditional plot structure of those three stories you read. Again, there's a lesson, there's something learned, and it's a harrowing lesson, right? So, and setting is important to that story as well. Setting is important to all of the stories. So I'm glad you read them and got a sense of setting before you learned about setting this week. But also, plot is really interesting in all of them. Yeah, Boys and Girls, just like what does it mean to be a woman, socialized as a woman when you don't really have a choice about it, and maybe you don't like all the things that come with that. And I mean, to be honest, as a female-bodied person, that is something that I still think about every single day, like what ways in society are we marginalized or relegated to something, whether or not we chose it, and how does that impact us, and how do we deal with it if it impacts us poorly, right? Really big questions in all of the stories. That question could apply to all the stories. I'm not sure if we're going to do discussion questions this week. I'm still getting my bearings and catching up with reading your response papers. But if we do, I'll probably throw out a couple questions about the stories, and you can choose which one to respond to. If I do, I'll give you actually an assignment page and a due date at the bottom of your course content for today. So I think that's all I wanted to say about the stories. Yeah.